A man stood in the howling dark, holding a dying child he couldn't save. Caleb Ward had buried his wife 3 weeks ago in frozen ground. Now her newborn daughter was starving to death in his arms, and he had no answers left. The baby's cries had faded to whispers. The storm outside matched the one tearing through his chest. He was a rancher who'd survived drought, debt, and loss. But this? This was different. This was watching hope die by inches. What happened next would either destroy him completely or save them both in the most unexpected way. If you want to see how this story ends, stay until the final word, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The wind had teeth that night. It tore across the Wyoming plains like something alive and hungry, battering the small cabin until the walls groaned and the windows rattled in their frames. Inside, Caleb Ward walked the same 4 steps he'd been walking for hours, from the fireplace to the cradle and back again, cradle to fireplace, an endless loop that solved nothing and changed nothing but kept his legs moving when everything else in him wanted to collapse. In his arms, wrapped in blankets that had once smelled like his wife, the baby made sounds that weren't quite cries anymore, more like hiccups, little gasps, the kind of noises that meant a body was running out of strength to protest its own suffering. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since he'd lowered Sarah into the ground. 3 weeks since he had stood in the cemetery outside Bitter Creek with his hat in his hands and his world in pieces, listening to words that meant nothing while the November cold bit through his coat. The preacher had talked about heaven and mercy and plans beyond human understanding. Caleb had nodded because that's what you did. But he hadn't heard a damn word of it. All he'd heard was the wind. The same wind that was trying to tear his cabin apart right now. Sarah had died the way she'd lived, quietly, without complaint, slipping away in the night while Caleb slept beside her. The birth had been hard. Too hard. The midwife had warned them, had said Sarah was bleeding too much, that her body wasn't recovering the way it should. But Sarah had smiled through her exhaustion, had held their daughter with trembling arms and said she just needed rest. Just a little rest, and she'd be fine. She'd lied. Or maybe she'd believed it. Caleb would never know. He'd woken to cold sheets and a silence so complete it had stopped his heart. For a moment, one terrible, crystalline moment, he'd thought she was just sleeping deeply. That if he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't disturb the stillness, she might stay that way forever. Peaceful. Present. Then the baby had cried, and reality had crashed back in. The funeral was small. Most of the town came. Bitter Creek wasn't big enough for privacy, and Sarah had been liked well enough. The women brought food. The men shook his hand and said they were sorry for his loss, their faces uncomfortable with grief they didn't know how to carry for someone else. Caleb had accepted their condolences with the numb politeness of a man going through motions, his daughter wrapped in blankets and passed between sympathetic arms while he stood beside a hole in the frozen earth. Nobody had asked if he needed help. Maybe they assumed he'd figure it out. He was Caleb Ward, after all, a rancher born and raised, a man who'd weathered his father's death and his mother's departure, who'd built a life from nothing but stubbornness and early mornings. If anyone could raise a child alone, it'd be him. They were wrong. The first night after the funeral, Caleb had tried to feed his daughter with a bottle and goat's milk the way the midwife suggested. The baby had screamed, not cried, screamed, a sound so raw and desperate it had made his hand shake. She'd turned her head away from the bottle, refused it with the kind of primal stubbornness that told him this wasn't just preference. This was rejection. He'd tried again and again. Different bottles, different temperatures, milk from the goat and milk from the cow, and even sugar water when nothing else worked. She'd taken a little sometimes, enough to wet her lips, maybe an ounce if he was patient, but never enough, never close to enough. By the second day, she was crying constantly. By the fourth, the crying had turned hoarse. By the end of the first week, Caleb had stopped sleeping entirely. He'd walk her through the night, bouncing her gently, singing songs his mother had sung to him when he was small, his voice cracking on words he'd half forgotten. Nothing helped. She was starving, and he couldn't stop it. The midwife came by after 10 days. Mrs. Brennan was a stout woman with capable hands and a face that had seen enough suffering to know when to speak and when to stay quiet. She'd examined the baby with professional efficiency. her expression growing darker with each passing moment. "She's not getting enough," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice flat. Not unkind, just factual. "You can see it in her color, in how she moves." "I'm trying everything," Caleb said. He heard the desperation in his own voice and hated it. "She won't take the bottle. Or she takes a little, and then some babies are like that," Mrs. said. Brennan handed the infant back to him with the careful gentleness of someone returning something fragile. "Their bodies know what they need, and what they need, you can't give them." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. "What am I supposed to do?" Caleb asked. Mrs. Brennan looked at him for a long moment. There was pity in her eyes, but also resignation. The look of someone who'd delivered too many babies into too much hardship, who knew how often the world didn't bend to accommodate what should be simple. "Find a wet nurse," she said finally. "It's the only way." "Where?" "I don't know." She pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. "Nearest I know of is in Casper, maybe Sheridan. But with winter coming on..." She trailed off. They both knew what she meant. The roads would be impassable soon. The snow was already falling harder each night. Even if he could make the journey, it would take days. Days his daughter didn't have. Mrs. Brennan left, and Caleb stood in the doorway watching her wagon disappear into the gray afternoon. The baby was quiet in his arms, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of a small body too tired to protest anymore. That's when the fear really set in. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a crisis that he could handle. He was used to emergencies, to cattle breaking through fences or storms coming up fast, or injuries that needed quick thinking. This was different. This was the slow, creeping fear of inevitability, the kind that whispered in the back of his mind that no matter what he did, it wouldn't be enough, that he was watching his daughter die in slow motion, and all his strength and experience and determination meant nothing against the simple fact that she needed something he couldn't provide. The days blurred together after that. He tried everything Mrs. Brennan had suggested, and things she hadn't. He mashed potatoes fine enough to mix with milk. He tried honey water. He even killed one of his chickens and made broth so thin it was barely more than warm liquid, hoping she'd take it from a spoon. She didn't. Each day she grew lighter in his arms. Her cries grew weaker. Her eyes, Sarah's eyes, the same deep brown that had made him fall in love 11 years ago, started to look hollow. He stopped going into town. Stopped checking on the cattle except for the bare minimum to keep them alive. The ranch, the life he'd built. None of it mattered if he couldn't keep this one small person breathing. So he stayed in the cabin, walking his endless loop, trying to will his daughter to live through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept the alternative. But will wasn't enough. By the time the storm hit, the real storm, the one that turned the world into a wall of white, Caleb had been awake for so long he'd started seeing shadows move in corners where nothing stood. His hand shook when he tried to stoke the fire. His thoughts moved like molasses, slow and thick and disconnected. The baby had stopped crying entirely. She just lay in his arms, her breath coming in small, irregular gasps. Her lips had a bluish tint. When he touched her cheek, her skin felt papery and cool. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. He'd survived his father's death from a fall off a spooked horse. He'd survived his mother leaving when he was 15, walking out in the middle of winter with nothing but a carpet bag and a note that said she was sorry, but she couldn't do it anymore. He'd survived drought and debt and the slow, grinding loneliness of building a life on land that didn't care whether he lived or died. But he wasn't going to survive this. The wind screamed outside, shaking the cabin so hard that dust sifted down from the rafters. The fire was burning low. He should add wood, should keep the heat going, but he couldn't make himself move. He just stood there, holding his daughter, watching her breathe, counting each small rise and fall of her chest, and wondering which one would be the last. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His voice was raw. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. I don't know what else to do." She didn't respond, didn't even open her eyes. Caleb felt something break inside him then, something he hadn't known was still intact. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. A simple acknowledgement that he'd failed, that all his strength and stubbornness hadn't been enough, that sometimes, no matter how hard you fought, you still lost. He thought about Sarah, about the way she'd smiled at him on their wedding day, nervous and radiant in a dress her sister had sewn, about the way she'd laughed when he'd tried to dance at their reception and nearly tripped over his own feet, about the way she'd held his hand during the bad years when the cattle were dying, and the bank was circling and everything felt like it was crumbling, and she'd said, "We'll figure it out, we always do." Except this time, they wouldn't. He carried his daughter to the rocking chair by the fire and sat down, cradling her against his chest. If this was going to be it, if this was the end, he wasn't going to let her die alone in the cradle. He'd hold her, he'd keep her warm, and when it was over, when her small heart finally stopped, he didn't know what he'd do. The fire popped, sending up a spray of sparks. Outside, the wind howled like something wounded. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to remember a prayer his mother had taught him when he was small, before she'd gotten hard and distant and angry at the life she'd chosen. But the words wouldn't come. There was nothing in his head but exhaustion and grief and the terrible, crushing weight of failing the one person who'd depended on him completely. Time passed. He didn't know how much. Could have been minutes. Could have been hours. Then, a sound. At first he thought he'd imagined it. A trick of the wind, maybe, or his exhausted mind creating phantom noises. But it came again, clearer this time. A knock. 3 sharp raps against the cabin door. Caleb's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. The knock came again, more insistent now, and he heard something else beneath it. A voice, muffled by the storm but unmistakably human. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." A woman's voice. Caleb stood on legs that threatened to buckle, his daughter still cradled against his chest. He crossed the cabin in 4 unsteady steps and yanked the door open. The wind nearly tore it from his hands. Standing on his porch, lit by the weak glow spilling from the cabin, was a woman he'd never seen before. She was soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes heavy with snow and ice. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were wide with fear and desperation. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm sorry to intrude. I got lost in the storm, and I saw your light, and I—" She broke off, her gaze dropping to the bundle in his arms. To the baby. "Oh," she whispered. Caleb should have said something, should have invited her in or asked her name or done any of the normal things a person does when a stranger shows up on their doorstep in the middle of a blizzard, but he just stood there, too tired and too broken to form words. The woman took a step forward, and the light fell fully across her face. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s, with a pale complexion and dark circles under her eyes that suggested she'd been traveling hard. But it was her expression that caught him. The way she was looking at his daughter, not with polite concern, with recognition. "Your baby," she said quietly. She's hungry, isn't she?" Something about the way she said it, the certainty, the understanding, made Caleb's throat tighten. "I can't feed her," he said. The words came out flat, defeated. "Her mother died. I've tried everything, but she can't." The woman stepped fully onto the porch, close enough now that he could see she was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears cutting tracks through the dirt and snow on her cheeks. "I can help," she said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "I can help." She looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes, grief and hope and desperate need, all tangled together. "I lost my baby 4 months ago, but my body, it's still." She stopped, her voice breaking. Then she steadied herself and said very clearly, "I can nurse her, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Caleb just stared at her. The storm roared around them, and the baby made a small, weak sound against his chest, and the stranger stood there shaking and crying and offering him something impossible, something that felt like a miracle he didn't deserve. "Come inside," he said finally. The woman stumbled past him into the cabin, bringing a gust of wind and snow with her. Caleb pushed the door shut and bolted it, then turned to find her standing by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, water dripping from her clothes onto the worn wooden floor. She looked around the cabin, taking in the cradle by the fire, The dishes piled in the dry sink, the general chaos of a man trying and failing to hold his life together. And then her gaze came back to the baby. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hands. Caleb hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him that this was wrong, that you didn't just hand your child to a stranger who'd appeared out of a storm like something from a ghost story. But he looked down at his daughter, at her bluish lips and shallow breathing, and he knew he was out of options. Slowly, carefully, he placed the baby in the woman's arms. She held the infant like she'd been made for it, with a natural grace that made Caleb's own clumsy attempts look like what they were, the desperate fumbling of someone learning a skill with no teacher and no time. The woman looked down at the baby, and her whole face softened. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I've got you now." Then, without ceremony or explanation, she sat down in the rocking chair, adjusted her wet coat, and began to nurse. The baby latched immediately. Caleb heard the small, desperate sounds of his daughter drinking, and something inside him shattered completely. His knees went weak. He grabbed the edge of the table to keep himself upright, and he watched, unable to look away, as his child fed for the first time in days. Really fed, not the reluctant sips from a bottle, but deep, hungry pulls that said her body knew exactly what it needed. Minutes passed. The wind battered the cabin. The fire crackled low. And the stranger rocked slowly in the chair, humming something soft and wordless, while Caleb's daughter drank and drank like she was trying to make up for every hungry hour she'd endured. Finally, the baby's eyes fluttered closed. Her body relaxed. She fell asleep still nursing, her small mouth slack and satisfied. The woman looked up at Caleb. She was still crying, but there was something else in her expression now. Relief, maybe, or purpose. "She's going to be okay," the woman said quietly. Caleb couldn't speak. If he tried, he'd fall apart completely. So he just nodded. The woman smiled, a small, sad thing, and looked back down at the sleeping baby. "My name is Eliza," she said. "Eliza Moore. Caleb Ward." His voice was barely a whisper. "And I don't even know what to call her. We hadn't settled on a name before." He trailed off. Eliza nodded, understanding without him having to finish. "She's beautiful," she said simply. They sat in silence after that, the storm raging outside while inside, for the first time in weeks, there was peace. The baby slept. Eliza rocked. And Caleb stood by the table, watching them both, trying to process what had just happened. A stranger had appeared in the middle of a blizzard. A woman who'd lost her own child. A woman whose body still carried the evidence of that loss. The milk that had nowhere to go. The maternal instinct with no outlet. And she'd saved his daughter's life. After a while, Eliza carefully shifted the baby, cradling her in one arm while adjusting her clothing with the other. "She'll be hungry again soon," she said. "Babies this young need to eat every few hours. If you want, I can stay until the storm passes. Make sure she's fed properly." Caleb realized, dimly, that he should probably ask questions. Where had Eliza come from? Where was she going? What was she doing alone in a Wyoming blizzard in the middle of winter? But he was too tired, and frankly, he didn't care. She'd done what he couldn't. That was enough. "The spare room's through there," he said, nodding toward the door on the far wall. "It's not much, but the bed's clean. You should rest." Eliza looked surprised, like she'd expected him to turn her away as soon as the immediate crisis passed. "Are you sure?" "You saved her life," Caleb said. It was the simplest truth he knew. "Stay as long as you need." Something shifted in Eliza's expression. Gratitude mixed with relief, mixed with something deeper that Caleb couldn't quite name. She nodded, then stood carefully, still cradling the sleeping baby. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he just gestured toward the spare room. Eliza walked past him, moving with the slow, exhausted grace of someone who'd been traveling for far too long. She paused in the doorway and looked back. "She really is beautiful," Eliza said again. "What's her last name?" "Ward, like mine." "And her first?" Caleb looked at the tiny, sleeping face visible in the blankets. Sarah had wanted to name her after her grandmother. "Elizabeth," she'd said. "A good, strong name." But standing here now, looking at the woman who'd appeared out of nowhere to save his daughter's life, another name came to mind. I don't know yet, he said quietly. I'll figure it out. Eliza nodded and disappeared into the spare room, taking the baby with her. The door closed with a soft click. Caleb stood alone in the main room, the fire burning low, the storm still screaming outside. He should add wood to the fire. Should eat something. He couldn't remember when he'd last had a real meal. Should try to sleep, though he doubted his body remembered how. Instead, he sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. For 3 weeks, he'd been drowning. For 3 weeks, he'd watched his daughter slip away despite everything he'd tried, every prayer he'd whispered, every desperate attempt to keep her alive. He'd been ready to give up, had been standing on the edge of total collapse. And then a stranger had knocked on his door. He didn't believe in divine intervention, didn't believe in miracles or fate, or the idea that things happened for a reason. The world was too random, too cruel for that kind of thinking. Sarah had died for no reason. Babies starved for no reason. Good people suffered while bad people prospered, and trying to find meaning in chaos was a fool's errand. But tonight he couldn't help but wonder. Outside, the wind began to die down. Not completely, but enough that the cabin stopped shaking, enough that the howling became a whisper. Caleb lifted his head and looked toward the spare room. Behind that door, his daughter was sleeping, safe, fed, alive. Because a woman he'd never met had appeared out of a storm at the exact moment he needed her most. He didn't have words for what he felt. Gratitude seemed too small. Relief didn't cover it. There was something bigger happening here, something he didn't understand and probably never would. All he knew was that his daughter was breathing. And for tonight, that was enough. The fire popped, sending up another spray of sparks. Caleb watched them rise and fade, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he let himself feel something other than fear. Hope. Fragile, uncertain, barely there, but hope nonetheless. He stood, added wood to the fire, and then walked to the spare room door. He didn't open it, just pressed his palm flat against the wood and listened. Inside, he could hear the soft sounds of breathing. 2 rhythms, overlapping, the baby and Eliza, both asleep. "Thank you," he whispered. He didn't know if he was talking to Eliza or to whoever had sent her. Maybe both. Maybe neither. It didn't matter. He went to his own room, lay down on the bed he'd shared with Sarah, and closed his eyes. Outside, the storm finally broke. The snow stopped falling. The wind faded to nothing, and inside the cabin, for the first time since Sarah died, there was peace. Caleb slept. When he woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the window. He lay still for a moment, disoriented, his body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't cure. Then memory returned. The storm, the stranger, his daughter finally feeding, and he sat up fast. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. He was out of bed and moving before his mind fully caught up, crossing the main room in 3 strides and pushing open the spare room door without knocking. Eliza sat in the chair by the window, the baby in her arms, both of them bathed in pale morning light. She looked up when he entered, startled, and he saw she'd been crying. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I was just feeding her, and I—" She stopped, her voice catching. Caleb looked at his daughter. Her color was better, her breathing steady. She was awake and alert, her small hand curled around Eliza's finger. "She's okay?" he asked. "She's perfect." Eliza's smile was watery but genuine. "She ate twice during the night. Good long feedings. She's strong, this one." Relief hit Caleb so hard his knees nearly buckled. He grabbed the door frame for support and just breathed for a moment, letting the reality sink in. His daughter was okay. She was going to survive. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Eliza looked down at the baby. "I should thank you," she said quietly. "Last night, when I knocked on your door, I wasn't sure you'd let me in, and if you hadn't, I don't think I would have made it through the storm." "Where were you coming from?" Eliza's expression closed off, just slightly. "East. I've been traveling for a while." "Alone?" "Yes." There was clearly more to the story, but Caleb didn't push. Whatever had brought Eliza Moore to his door in the middle of a blizzard was her business. All that mattered was that she was here. "Stay," he said suddenly. The word surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "At least until she's strong enough until she's stable. I can pay you, not much, but I've got some money saved and—" "No." Eliza cut him off, her voice firm. "I don't want your money." "Then what?" She looked at him, and there was something raw in her eyes, something that spoke of grief so deep it had bones. "Just let me help her," she said. "That's all I need." Caleb nodded slowly. He didn't understand, not really, but he recognized pain when he saw it. Eliza Moore was running from something, or maybe toward something, and his daughter had become part of that journey. He could accept that. As long as his little girl kept breathing, he could accept anything. "All right," he said. "Then stay." Eliza's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you." Caleb left her there and went to start breakfast. The morning routine was familiar. Building up the fire, putting coffee on to boil, frying eggs and salt pork in the cast-iron skillet. Normal tasks that felt almost surreal after weeks of chaos. When Eliza emerged from the spare room a while later, she'd changed out of her wet clothes into a simple brown dress she must have had in her traveling bag. Her hair was still damp but combed, pulled back in a neat braid. She looked younger in the daylight, and so tired that Caleb wondered when she'd last slept properly. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. She did, accepting a plate with quiet gratitude. They ate in silence, the baby sleeping in a makeshift bed Caleb had fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets. "What's her name?" Eliza asked eventually. Caleb looked at his daughter. He'd been thinking about it all morning. Sarah had wanted Elizabeth, but watching Eliza hold his child, watching the tenderness and care she showed, he found himself thinking of something else. "Emma," he said. It had been his grandmother's name. A strong woman who'd crossed the plains in a wagon and built a life in territory that didn't want her. It felt right. "Emma Rose Ward." Eliza smiled. "That's beautiful." They finished breakfast, and Caleb showed Eliza where things were. The well out back, the root cellar, the barn where he kept the livestock. The day passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Eliza fed Emma every few hours, and between feedings she helped with small tasks around the cabin. She didn't talk much, but her presence filled spaces that had been empty too long. That evening, after Emma had been fed and put down in her cradle, Caleb and Eliza sat by the fire. Outside, the world was buried in snow, 3 feet at least, drifted higher against the buildings. "It'll be a while before the roads are passable," Caleb said, staring into the flames. "I know. You're welcome to stay, for as long as it takes." Eliza pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Your wife, when did she—" 3 weeks ago. The words still felt impossible. "The birth went hard. She lost too much blood, and by the time we realized how bad it was—" He trailed off. Some stories didn't need endings spelled out. "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. "What about you?" Caleb asked. "You said you lost a baby." Eliza was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Her name was Grace. She was born too early, lived 3 days." She pressed her hand to her chest, over her heart. "I still feel her sometimes, like she's still with me." "Where's her father?" Eliza's face hardened. "Gone. He left before she was born. Said he couldn't handle the responsibility." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turned out he was right. He couldn't. They sat in silence after that. 2 people bound by loss, by grief, by the strange mercy of survival. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it wasn't the violent storm of the night before. Just the normal winter cold, the kind you learn to live with. And inside, Emma slept peacefully, her belly full, her breathing steady. The beginning of something new. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both seemed to need. Eliza woke before dawn, as she had every morning of her adult life, and fed Emma in the dim light before the sun broke over the eastern ridge. Caleb would hear them through the thin walls, the soft sounds of the baby nursing, Eliza's low humming, the creak of the rocking chair, and he'd lie there for a moment before rising, letting himself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be all right. By the time he emerged from his room, Eliza would have coffee made, and Emma settled back in her cradle, and they'd move through the morning tasks with the efficiency of people who understood that survival required routine. He'd tend the livestock while she tidied the cabin. She'd prepare meals while he chopped wood. They worked around each other like dancers learning a new step, awkward at first, then gradually finding a shared pace. They didn't talk much those first few days. There didn't seem to be much to say that hadn't already been said, or maybe they were both too raw to risk saying more. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd both learned that sometimes words just got in the way of healing. Emma grew stronger. Her color deepened to a healthy pink. Her cries became vigorous instead of weak, and she started staying awake for longer periods, her dark eyes tracking movement across the room with the focused intensity of the very young. Every time Caleb looked at her, he felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, mixed with gratitude, mixed with a fierce, protective love that surprised him with its intensity. On the fifth morning, he woke to find Eliza in the kitchen, flour dusting her hands, working dough on the counter with practiced efficiency. "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked up, startled. "Do what?" "Bake, cook, any of it. You're already—" He gestured helplessly toward Emma, trying to find words for something that felt too big for language. "You've already done more than I could ever repay." Eliza's expression softened. "I need to keep busy," she said quietly. "If I stop moving, I start thinking, and if I start thinking—" She trailed off, but Caleb understood. He knew all about the kind of thoughts that came in stillness, the memories that waited in quiet moments to drag you under. "All right," he said, "but at least let me help." So they worked together, Eliza teaching him how to knead bread properly, laughing when his first attempts produced misshapen lumps that looked more like rocks than loaves. It was a small sound, that laugh, but it changed something in the cabin, made it feel less like a place where people were just surviving and more like a place where people might actually live. That afternoon, while Emma slept and Eliza rested in her room, Caleb rode out to check the fence lines on the north pasture. The snow was still deep, his horse struggling through drifts that came up past its knees, but the sky was clear and cold and the sun was bright enough to make him squint. He'd neglected the ranch badly over the past few weeks. He could see it in the sagging fence posts, the gate that hung crooked on its hinges, the general air of disrepair that accumulated when no one was paying attention. It would take weeks of work to set everything right again. Maybe months. But for the first time since Sarah died, he felt capable of doing that work. Like he had a reason to care about fence posts and gates, and whether the cattle had enough feed to make it through the winter. Emma needed him to keep the ranch running. And Eliza? Well, Eliza needed somewhere to be. Somewhere that wasn't whatever she'd been running from when she'd shown up on his doorstep. He fixed what he could that day, his hands clumsy in heavy gloves, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. When he rode back as the sun was setting, he found Eliza on the porch, Emma bundled in her arms, both of them watching the horizon turn gold and pink and purple. "She likes the sunset," Eliza said without turning around. "Gets quiet when she sees the colors." Caleb dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. He climbed the steps and stood beside them, looking at his daughter's face. Emma's eyes were wide, fixed on the sky, her small mouth working in the way babies do when they're processing something new. "Sarah loves sunsets," he said. The words came out before he could stop them, and for a moment he tensed, waiting for the grief to crash over him the way it had every other time he'd spoken her name. But it didn't. Not this time. "Tell me about her," Eliza said softly. So he did. Standing on the porch in the fading light, with his daughter in a stranger's arms and the cold seeping through his coat, Caleb talked about Sarah. About how they'd met at a church social when he was 20 and she was 18, both of them awkward and uncertain and trying to figure out how to dance without stepping on each other's feet. About how she'd been the one to propose, actually, after 3 years of courtship that was going nowhere because Caleb was too scared to risk rejection. About how she'd made the cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep between workdays. "She wanted 6 children," he said, his voice rough. "Used to talk about filling this place with noise and chaos. Said she'd grown up in a quiet house and hated it, wanted something different for her own kids." He looked down at Emma. Guess she'll have to settle for one. She'd be proud of you, Eliza said, for keeping Emma alive, for not giving up. I was about to. The night you came, I'd given up. I was just waiting for it to be over. But you didn't. You opened the door. That counts for something. They stayed there until the last light drained from the sky and the cold drove them inside. Eliza fed Emma again, then put her down in the cradle, and Caleb made dinner, venison stew from meat he'd hung in the cold cellar, thick and heavy, and exactly what his body needed after a day working in the snow. They ate at the table, the fire crackling behind them, Emma sleeping peacefully nearby. It felt almost domestic, almost normal, like they were a family instead of two strangers thrown together by circumstance and desperation. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said, breaking the comfortable silence. Eliza looked up from her bowl. "Sure." "Where were you going when you got lost in the storm?" Her expression shuddered, the openness disappearing behind a wall of careful neutrality. "West," she said. "Just west." "That's not much of an answer." "Well, it's the only one I have." She set down her spoon, her hands folding in her lap. "I've been traveling for 3 months, ever since Grace died. I couldn't stay where I was. Every street, every building, everything reminded me of what I'd lost. So I left. Bought a ticket on the stage and just kept going." "You got family out west?" "No, I've got nobody." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was commenting on the weather. "My parents died when I was 16. Fever took them both within a week. Grace's father was all I had, and when he left," she shrugged, "I figured west was as good a direction as any." Caleb thought about that, about being completely alone in the world, with no anchor, no place that felt like home. He'd lost his father, and his mother had abandoned him, but he'd always had the ranch, the land, something solid to hold on to when everything else fell apart. "You could stay here," he said. The words surprised him, but once they were out, he didn't want to take them back. "Not just until the road's clear. I mean, really stay. Emma needs you, and I could use the help with the ranch, and I can't." Eliza cut him off, her voice tight. "That's not... I can't just move into your life like this. People would talk. They'd say things. About me, about you, about what it means that I'm here." "Let them talk." "You don't understand." She stood abruptly, moving to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. "I'm not respectable, Caleb. I had a baby without being married. In the towns I've passed through, people look at women like me like we're diseased, like we're dangerous. If I stay here, if people find out, they'll say terrible things. About both of us. I don't care what people say." "You should." She turned to face him, and there were tears in her eyes. "You have a daughter to think about. Emma deserves better than to grow up with people whispering about why her father's living with a woman who isn't his wife." Caleb stood too, facing her across the small cabin. "Emma deserves to grow up healthy and fed and loved. That's what she deserves. And right now, you're the only reason she's getting any of those things. Only because I happened to show up when you needed me. That doesn't mean... it means everything." His voice was fierce now, all the gratitude and fear and desperate hope of the past week boiling over. "You saved her life, Eliza. Do you understand that? My daughter would be dead if you hadn't knocked on that door, so I don't give a damn what anyone in town thinks about you being here. They don't get a vote." Eliza stared at him, her breath coming fast, tears streaming down her face. "I can't replace her," she whispered. "Your wife. I'm not trying to. I would never. I know that." Caleb took a step closer, gentling his voice. "Nobody's asking you to replace anyone. I'm just asking you to stay, to help me raise Emma, to be..." He fumbled for the right word. "To be family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them had intended, but both seemed to feel. Family. Not by blood or marriage or any conventional arrangement, but by choice, by necessity, by the simple fact that they needed each other and Emma needed them both. Eliza wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. "Do what?" "Stay in one place. Let myself care. Every time I've tried to build something, it falls apart. My parents died. Grace died. Her father left. I'm scared that if I stay, if I let myself believe this could work, something terrible will happen again." "Something terrible might happen," Caleb admitted. "Or it might not. But running won't change that. All running does is guarantee you'll be alone when it does. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing it, the risk of staying against the certainty of leaving, the possibility of belonging against the safety of isolation. Finally, she nodded, just a small dip of her head, but it felt like a promise. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll stay, for now." It wasn't a permanent commitment, wasn't even close, but it was enough. That night, Caleb lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was drowning. He still missed Sarah, would always miss her, but the grief didn't feel quite so crushing anymore. It had made room for something else, something that felt almost like hope. In the spare room, Eliza fed Emma one last time before they both slept. She held the baby close, breathing in the sweet smell of her, letting herself feel the connection she'd been afraid to acknowledge. She'd told Caleb she would stay for now, but sitting there in the darkness with Emma in her arms, she knew she was lying to herself. She wasn't staying for now. She was staying because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to live for, and this tiny baby had given her a reason to keep breathing. The next week passed in a blur of small moments that somehow added up to something bigger. Caleb taught Eliza how to milk the cow, laughing when she squeaked in surprise the first time warm milk hit the bucket. Eliza taught Caleb how to properly change Emma's diaper without getting everything soaked. They argued over dinner, good-natured bickering about whether stew needed more salt or if the bread was done baking, and discovered they both liked their coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. Emma thrived. She gained weight, her cheeks filling out, her arms and legs growing plump and healthy. She started smiling, not the reflexive grimaces of a newborn, but real, responsive smiles that lit up her whole face. The first time she smiled at Caleb, he nearly cried. The first time she smiled at Eliza, she did cry. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, wiping her eyes. "I don't know why I'm being so foolish." "You're not foolish," Caleb said. He was standing at the stove, stirring oatmeal, trying to give her privacy for her emotions. "You're just human." 10 days after Eliza's arrival, the weather broke enough for Caleb to ride into Bitter Creek for supplies. He'd been putting it off, knowing he couldn't avoid it forever, but dreading the inevitable questions about who the woman was that he'd taken in during the storm. "I won't be long," he told Eliza as he saddled his horse. "Few hours at most. Will you be all right?" "We'll be fine." She stood on the porch with Emma bundled against her chest, both of them watching him prepare to leave. "Take your time. Get everything you need." He rode out under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, the snow glittering like diamonds in the morning sun. The road was rough, drifted in places, but passable. Other travelers had been through recently, wagon ruts frozen into the surface, hoofprints marking the path. Bitter Creek was small even by frontier standards. One main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a livery, and about 24 houses scattered around the edges. Caleb had lived within 20 miles of it his whole life, had gone to school in the church basement, had bought his first horse from the livery owner when he was 14. He knew everyone, and everyone knew him, which meant everyone knew about Sarah. The moment he walked into the general store, the conversation stopped.